January 17th, 1940, somewhere along the Franco-German border. The winter fog hung thick over the Maginot Line, blanketing the concrete fortresses in a cold, wet silence. French soldiers huddled in their bunkers, smoking cigarettes and playing cards, their breath visible in the frigid air. Above them, in a chateau 30 miles behind the front, a general sat at a polished mahogany desk, studying maps that were already obsolete. The fire crackled in the marble hearth. Crystal decanters of cognac stood untouched. He traced a finger along the colored lines representing fortifications, endless kilometers of steel and concrete, and smiled. The smile of a man who believed he had already won the war. He was not alone. Across Europe, in every war room and command post, men with stars on their shoulders and ribbons on their chests gazed at maps with the same confidence. They had studied the Great War. They had read Clausewitz and Jomini. They knew with absolute certainty how modern war would be fought, and they were catastrophically wrong. In the early months of 1940, the greatest danger facing the Allied nations was not the panzer divisions massing in the Ardennes. It was not the Luftwaffe squadrons hidden in camouflaged hangars. It was not even the fanatical ideology pouring out of Berlin. The most dangerous thing in the world at that moment was a confident but clueless general, a man entrusted with the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, armed with outdated doctrine and utterly convinced of his own brilliance. The phenomenon was not new. Throughout history, wars have been lost not by inferior soldiers, but by superior fools. Men who mistook rank for wisdom, men who confused past victories with future guarantees, men who, in the face of revolution, clung to tradition as if it were a life raft in a storm, not realizing tradition itself had become the anchor dragging them under. By 1940, the nature of warfare had undergone a seismic transformation. The tank, once a clumsy experiment crawling across the mud of the Somme, had evolved into a weapon of devastating speed and power. Radio communication allowed coordination across vast distances in real time. Dive bombers could deliver precision strikes that shattered morale as effectively as they shattered concrete. The marriage of armor, air power, and rapid mechanized infantry had created something unprecedented: blitzkrieg, lightning war, a new doctrine that rendered the static defenses of the previous generation as useless as medieval castle walls against artillery. But in Paris, in London, in a dozen capitals across Europe and Asia, generals looked at these developments and saw only variations on familiar themes. They had spent their entire careers preparing to refight 1918. Their academies taught the lessons of Verdun and the Somme. Their war games assumed static fronts, massed infantry, and grinding attrition. When they looked at Poland's collapse in September 1939, they did not see a preview of their own future. They saw an anomaly: Polish incompetence, Slavic disorganization. Surely, they told themselves, it could never happen to a proper Western army. This was not mere stupidity. It was something far more dangerous: institutional arrogance married to cognitive rigidity. These were intelligent men, many of them. They could quote Napoleonic campaigns from memory. They understood logistics and supply chains. But intelligence without adaptability is just elaborate foolishness, and in their certainty, they became the architects of catastrophe. General Maurice Gamelin sat in his headquarters at Vincennes, outside Paris, surrounded by the trappings of command. He was 67 years old, a veteran of the Great War, respected by his peers, trusted by his government. He had no radio in his command post. He preferred written orders delivered by motorcycle courier. He believed modern technology made commanders lazy, divorced them from the timeless principles of warfare. He would wage this new war with the wisdom of the old. When intelligence reports showed German armor concentrating near the Ardennes, he dismissed them. The Ardennes was impassable for tanks. Everyone knew that. It was in all the manuals.
On May 10, 1940, the German army launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, Panzer columns poured through the Ardennes like a steel flood, covering terrain the French High Command had declared impossible. Within hours, the careful plans laid out in Parisian chateaux became irrelevant paper. Within days, entire French armies found themselves encircled, cut off from supply and communication. Within 6 weeks, France, victorious in the Great War, possessing one of the largest armies in the world, would surrender. Gamelin did not lack intelligence, he lacked imagination. He could not conceive that warfare had fundamentally changed. He fought with the methods that had worked before, applying them with increasing desperation to a situation they could not address. By the time he was relieved of command on May 19th, the battle was already lost. His replacement inherited not an army, but a disaster in progress. The pattern repeated itself across theaters and nations. In the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. On paper, it should have been a brief campaign, a giant crushing a mouse. The Red Army had overwhelming numerical superiority, modern equipment, and the backing of Stalin's industrial machine. They had generals, too. Hundreds of them, survivors of Stalin's purges, men who had learned the most important military skill of all, telling the dictator what he wanted to hear. They told Stalin that Finland would fall in weeks. They told him the Finnish people would welcome liberation. They told him that the Red Army, reformed and modernized, was invincible. Then they sent their soldiers into the frozen forests of Karelia in parade ground formations, without winter equipment, following tactics designed for the steppes of Central Asia. The Finns slaughtered them. Small mobile units on skis ambushed Soviet columns, trapped on frozen roads. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees. Soviet soldiers froze in their trenches. Officers, promoted for political reliability rather than competence, ordered suicidal frontal assaults against prepared defenses. In the Battle of Rate Road, a single Finnish regiment destroyed 2 Soviet divisions. 9,000 Soviet soldiers died. Their bodies, frozen solid, were stacked like cordwood along the roadside. The war became an international humiliation. The Soviet Union eventually prevailed through sheer mass, throwing enough men and material at the problem until Finnish resistance collapsed, but the cost was staggering. Nearly 130,000 Soviet soldiers dead. The myth of Red Army invincibility shattered. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched and learned the wrong lesson. He concluded that the Soviet military was a paper tiger led by incompetence, ripe for conquest. 2 years later, he would launch Operation Barbarossa, based partly on that assessment. The confident but clueless generals in Moscow had endangered not just their own soldiers, but the entire nation. The phenomenon was not limited to one side or one ideology. In the Pacific, as tensions rose between the United States and Japan, American commanders in the Philippines prepared for war under General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was perhaps the most confident general of the entire war, a man of theatrical pronouncements and absolute self-assurance. He had been a hero in the First World War. He had served as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. He was brilliant, charismatic, and frequently wrong. In the months before Pearl Harbor, MacArthur assured Washington that his forces could defend the Philippines indefinitely. He claimed his Air Force, a collection of obsolete B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters, would dominate the Pacific. He requested and received additional resources based on these assurances. When Japanese forces struck on December 8, 1941, Philippine time, his Air Force was destroyed on the ground, caught in neat rows despite hours of warning. His grand defensive plans collapsed within weeks. By March 1942, MacArthur evacuated to Australia, leaving his starving, surrounded troops to endure the Bataan Death March. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for this campaign, a monument to confidence rewarded despite catastrophic failure. But MacArthur was not uniquely flawed. He was simply the most prominent example of a systemic problem. Across the Pacific, British generals in Singapore assured London that the island fortress was impregnable from the sea.
when Japanese forces attacked through the Malayan jungle from the north on bicycles and light tanks, the defenders were psychologically unprepared. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, a competent staff officer thrust into field command, found himself outmaneuvered and outthought at every turn. On February 15, 1942, he surrendered 80,000 troops to a Japanese force half that size. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. What linked these failures was not cowardice or treason, it was the deadly combination of institutional inertia and personal certainty. These men had been trained in systems that rewarded conformity and punished innovation. They had risen through ranks by mastering the previous war's lessons. They were experts in obsolete warfare, and their expertise blinded them to present reality.
The psychological mechanism was well understood even then, though rarely acknowledged. It is easier to fit new information into existing frameworks than to rebuild the framework entirely. A general who has spent 30 years learning one way of war cannot easily abandon that knowledge. It would mean admitting decades of study were wasted, that the foundation of professional identity was false. So instead, the mind performs subtle distortions. Contradictory evidence is dismissed as exception or error. Reports that challenge assumptions are questioned, while those that confirm bias are accepted without scrutiny. The map becomes more real than the territory. And rank amplified this cognitive failing. A private who suggests the emperor has no clothes faces ridicule and punishment. A colonel who questions doctrine risks his career, but a general who ignores reality faces no immediate consequences until the battle begins. By then, it is too late. The institutional structure that elevated these men to command also insulated them from corrective feedback until disaster was unavoidable. The Germans understood this better than most, at least initially. Their doctrine emphasized Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders. Commanders stated objectives but allowed subordinates wide latitude in execution. This encouraged initiative and flexibility. It allowed the system to route around incompetent leadership at higher levels because decision-making was distributed. When a German general proved incapable, junior officers could adapt and improvise. But even the Wehrmacht was not immune. As the war progressed and Hitler increasingly dominated strategic decision-making, the German military suffered under its own version of confident incompetence. A dictator with no military training, convinced of his own genius, overruling professionals and demanding impossible victories. By 1943, German generals who had pioneered mobile warfare found themselves ordered to hold untenable positions for symbolic reasons. The flexibility that had been their strength was strangled by ideology and ego. They too discovered that confidence without competence is just slow-motion suicide. There were exceptions, men who adapted. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat before World War II. He was a staff officer, an organizer, a diplomat in uniform. But he possessed qualities more valuable than battlefield experience: humility, the ability to listen, and the wisdom to delegate to experts. He surrounded himself with competent subordinates, Patton, Bradley, Montgomery, and managed the coalition that liberated Europe. His confidence was institutional rather than personal. He believed in the system, the industrial might, the democratic process, rather than his own infallibility. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov learned from catastrophe. He had witnessed the purges, survived Stalin's paranoia, and studied the disasters of 1941. He was brutal, pragmatic, and adaptable. He learned German tactics and developed counters. He learned to manage Stalin's interference while retaining operational flexibility. He was not a pleasant man or a democratic one, but he was effective, a general who evolved with the war rather than clinging to doctrine. But even the Japanese, whose military culture emphasized obedience and traditional honor, produced leaders who understood modern warfare.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had studied in America and warned his government that war with the United States was folly. When ordered to fight anyway, he designed operations based on realistic assessment of strengths and weaknesses rather than nationalist fantasy. His death in 1943 removed one of the few Japanese senior commanders who understood they were losing. But these were minority cases. For every adaptive leader, there were a dozen who clung to certainty even as it drowned them, and the cost was measured in frozen corpses along Finnish roads, in prisoners marching into captivity at Singapore, in the burned wreckage of French towns where outdated tactics met modern firepower. The symbolic object of this story is not a weapon or a piece of technology, it is the map. In every command post, in every headquarters, maps covered the walls. Colored pins and flags marked unit positions. Lines showed boundaries and objectives. These maps represented control, understanding, the ability to impose order on chaos. Generals studied them for hours, moving symbols representing thousands of men as if playing an elaborate game.
But the map is not the territory. The map shows what the cartographer believes is there, filtered through doctrine and assumption. It does not show mud that bogs down tanks. It does not show panicked soldiers fleeing faster than information can travel. It does not show the gap between what orders say and what reality permits. The confident but clueless general stares at the map and sees what he expects to see, what he was trained to see, what his career depends on seeing. The map becomes a mirror, reflecting his own certainty back at him, confirming his genius even as his army disintegrates. There is a photograph, famous in military history circles, taken in May 1940. It shows French officers gathered around a map table in a requisition chateau. They wear immaculate uniforms. The lighting is perfect. They are posed like a Renaissance painting, faces serious, fingers pointing at map features. The photograph was staged for propaganda to show competence, control, Allied unity. It was taken 2 days before the German breakthrough. Within a week, those officers would be fleeing south, their elaborate plans worthless, their maps abandoned in the retreat. The photograph captured not reality, but delusion. Men studying maps while history routed around them. The lesson should have been obvious. It was not. After France fell, British generals studied the campaign and concluded the French had been poorly led, which was true, but failed to fully internalize the implications for their own doctrine. Soviet generals watched France collapse and concluded Western Europeans lacked ideological conviction, missing the tactical revolution entirely. American generals observed from across the Atlantic and debated whether tanks should be organic to infantry divisions or organized as separate armored corps, a doctrinal argument largely disconnected from the reality of mechanized warfare's speed and violence. The institution's immune system fought against learning. After each disaster, investigations sought specific causes, this general's failure, that unit's cowardice, rather than systemic problems. It was psychologically easier to blame individuals than to admit the entire structure was flawed. Courts-martial and dismissals provided catharsis without correction. New generals, promoted from the same system, repeated variations of the same mistakes until enough failures accumulated to force doctrinal change. The learning curve was steep, and it was paved with corpses. By 1943, most major powers had updated their doctrine, adapted their training, and promoted a new generation of leaders who understood modern warfare. But those years of adjustment cost millions of lives. How many soldiers died because a general could not abandon tactics of 1918? How many cities burned because a commander clung to defensive strategies rendered obsolete by technology? The numbers are incalculable, but they are not theoretical. Each represents a specific person, a farm boy from Iowa, a factory worker from Manchester, a student from Leningrad, whose life ended because someone far away, staring at a map, could not imagine being wrong. The epilogue of this story is unwritten because it continues. The confident but clueless general did not retire with the end of World War II.
He reappears in every conflict, wearing different uniforms, speaking different languages, but always recognizable. He appears in the jungles of Vietnam, certain that superior firepower guarantees victory against an insurgency. He appears in the mountains of Afghanistan, convinced that technology replaces understanding. He appears in boardrooms and capitals, applying outdated models to novel problems, mistaking experience for wisdom. The danger is not that such men exist. Human nature produces overconfidence in every generation. The danger is that institutions elevate them, that systems reward certainty over curiosity, that cultures confuse confidence with competence. The danger is that we build structures that insulate decision-makers from the consequences of their decisions until those consequences become catastrophic. In January 1940, a general sat in a warm chateau staring at a map, certain of victory. 6 months later, his nation was occupied, his army destroyed, his certainty revealed as delusion. He was not evil, he was not stupid. He was simply a man who could not imagine that everything he knew was wrong, and that made him the most dangerous thing in the world. The question is not whether such men will appear again. They will. The question is whether we will recognize them before the maps they study become graveyards.